Emmy Goering wore diamonds looted from Jewish families and had 500 military planes fly over Berlin just because she gave birth. But by May 1945, she was hauling water from a well in a cottage with no electricity. And she was not even the wife who had it worst, because another one of them murdered all 6 of her own children rather than face a world without Hitler. The golden cage they called a marriage. Before we get to the rubble and the ruin, you need to understand what these women actually had, because nobody loses a lifestyle like this without completely unraveling in the process. Emmy Goering, born Emmy Sonnemann, was a respected stage actress in Weimar, Germany, before she married Hermann Goering in April 1935 at a ceremony that Adolf Hitler himself attended as the official witness. The wedding was broadcast on national radio across the entire country, and tens of thousands of Germans lined the streets of Berlin just to catch a glimpse of the couple. From that moment forward, Emmy became something like the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, hosting elaborate state functions and standing beside foreign diplomats, royalty, and heads of state at every major Nazi gathering. Her husband owned mansions, estates and castles scattered across Austria, Germany and Poland, and had assembled one of the largest private art collections in all of Europe, much of it looted directly from Jewish families who were being shipped off to concentration camps and extermination centers. Their country estate, Karinhall, was a sprawling hunting lodge north of Berlin that housed Renaissance paintings, medieval tapestries, and golden artifacts that Hermann had personally selected from the homes of families he helped destroy. When their daughter Edda was born in June 1938, Hermann Goering ordered 500 Luftwaffe aircraft to fly over Berlin in celebration, and reportedly told people he would have flown 1,000 planes if the baby had been a boy instead. But Emmy was not alone at the top of this twisted social hierarchy, and the competition between these women was genuinely vicious, in a way that tells you everything about how the Nazi elite actually lived behind closed doors. Magda Goebbels, married to Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, was fighting Emmy tooth and nail for the title of First Lady, and the rivalry between these two women was so intense that Hitler himself had to intervene more than once to keep the peace. Magda delivered the first Nazi Mother's Day speech on national radio in 1933, and was constantly photographed alongside her 6 blonde children, presenting the image of the ideal Aryan family unit to millions of Germans through weekly newsreels and state propaganda films. She received the Cross of Honor of the German Mother in 1938, the very first woman to receive that specific award, which Hitler created to honor women who were producing children for the Reich. Hitler adored Magda personally, so much so that he refused to let her divorce Joseph, even when she begged to leave him in 1938, because of his relentless and humiliating affairs with younger women, including a Czech actress named Lida Barova. And then there was Lina Heydrich, married to Reinhard Heydrich, the man the Nazis themselves nicknamed the Blonde Beast, who ran the SS intelligence service and helped organize the systematic murder of millions during the Holocaust. Lina had actually been the one who pushed Reinhard into joining the SS in the first place, literally packing his suitcase and sending him to Munich for an interview with Himmler after Himmler had already cancelled their appointment. She ignored the cancellation entirely, and that single act of stubbornness helped launch one of the most feared intelligence operations in the history of espionage. These women were not passive bystanders watching from the sidelines of their marriages, and the world they built together was about to collapse on top of all of them at once. When the bombs stopped and the courts came calling, the Germany these women knew vanished almost overnight in the spring of 1945, because cities that once glittered with Nazi flags and military parades were now reduced to smoking craters of rubble, ash, and the stench of unburied bodies. Somewhere around 70% of central Berlin was completely destroyed, and the women who had been throwing lavish dinner parties just months earlier were now scavenging for food in the ruins alongside millions of ordinary Germans who had lost everything. And the Allies were not interested in drawing a neat line between the men who gave the orders and the women who benefited from every single one of them. Emmy Goering was among the first to fall hard. After Hermann Goering was captured by American troops near Berchtesgaden and put on trial at Nuremberg for war crimes, alongside 23 other surviving Nazi leaders, Emmy and their 7-year-old daughter Edda were detained and held in an Allied internment facility in Luxembourg. They spent over 2 years in various forms of confinement, moving between camps and prisons as the legal machinery of the occupation ground slowly forward. Herman was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to death by hanging, and then cheated the executioner by biting down on a hidden cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946. Emmy became a widow overnight, and the glamorous lifestyle she had known for an entire decade was completely and permanently gone. She and Edda were eventually relocated to a tiny 2-room cottage in the rural Bavarian village of Sackdilling, with no running water, no electricity, and barely enough food to survive through what turned out to be one of the harshest and most brutal winters in modern European memory. However, Emmy did not accept her new reality quietly or with any kind of grace. In 1948, she was hauled before a German denazification court, where prosecutors argued that her years of hosting Nazi state functions and flaunting her status as the unofficial First Lady amounted to active endorsement of the regime. The court convicted her and sentenced her to 1 year in a labor camp, confiscated 30% of whatever property she still had, and banned her from performing on any stage in Germany for 5 years. Her acting career, the one identity she had before the Nazis consumed her life, was stripped away along with everything else. And yet, even inside the labor camp, Emmy hung photographs of Herman on the walls of her cell, which resulted in repeated punishments from the camp staff who could not believe what they were seeing. She published her memoirs in 1967 under the title By My Husband's Side, and never once, in the entire book, or in any public statement for the rest of her life, expressed a single word of regret for her role in what happened under the Third Reich. The mother who chose cyanide over surrender. Magda Goebbels never stood before a denazification court because she made a decision on the evening of May 1, 1945, that remains one of the most disturbing acts committed by any individual during the entire Second World War. As Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin, Magda and Joseph Goebbels had already moved their 6 children, aged 4 to 12, into the concrete bunker complex beneath the building. Witnesses who spent time with the family in those final days remembered the children as sweet, cheerful, and completely unaware of the horror that was about to happen. They played with Hitler's dog Blondie and performed songs for the adults who were preparing to die around them. Multiple people offered to smuggle the kids out of Berlin to safety, including Hitler's own architect, Albert Speer. But Magda turned down every single offer. She told Secretary Traudl Junge that she would rather see her children dead than growing up in a Germany where their father's name meant nothing but shame and genocide. On that evening, with the help of Hitler's personal physician, Ludwig Stumpfegger, and an SS dentist named Helmut Kuntz, Magda first had all 6 children sedated with morphine injections around 8:40 in the evening. Kuntz later testified that he gave the injections himself, but then refused to administer the poison, so Magda sent him to fetch Stumpfegger instead. While the children lay unconscious in a room containing 3 sets of bunk beds, cyanide capsules were crushed between their teeth one by one. The eldest daughter, 12-year-old Helga, may not have been fully sedated when the poison was administered, because Soviet doctors who examined her body later found bruises across her face and jaw, strongly suggesting she had fought back against what was being done to her in those final moments. When Red Army soldiers entered the bunker on May 3rd, they found all 6 children lying in their nightclothes, with ribbons still carefully tied in the girls' hair, as if they had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. The last surviving bunker witness, a radioman named Rokas Mish, recalled decades later that just minutes before Magda led the children upstairs, the youngest girl, Haida, had turned back to look at him, and reciting a silly rhyme. Mish said he suspected in that moment exactly what was about to happen, and spent the rest of his entire life regretting that he did not intervene. After the children were dead, Magda and Joseph walked into the Chancellery garden and took their own lives with poison and gunfire. The widow who took the government to court. While Magda chose death and Emmy chose stubborn defiance from inside a labor camp cell, Lina Heydrich chose something arguably even more brazen than either of them. She chose to sue the post-war German government for money. After Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in Prague in June 1942, Hitler personally awarded Lina a 32-room country estate in occupied Czechoslovakia that had been confiscated from Jewish sugar industrialist Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer. Lina lived there for the remainder of the war with her 4 children, and according to post-war testimony from people who survived that estate, she physically abused the Jewish forced laborers who worked her land on a regular basis. When the Soviet army began its advance in April 1945, Lina grabbed her children and fled westward through the chaos of collapsing Germany until she reached the island of Fehmarn, where the family had roots going back generations. And then came the part that absolutely infuriated people across post-war Europe and still makes historians shake their heads to this day. Lina Heydrich was cleared during the denazification proceedings, walked away without any conviction on her record, and then turned around in the 1950s and formally demanded that the West German government pay her a widow's pension. Her argument was that Reinhard had technically been a police general who was killed in the line of duty while serving his country, and therefore she was entitled to the same benefits as any other war widow in Germany. The government fought back aggressively because of Reinhard's direct and well-documented role in organizing the Holocaust. But Lina hired lawyers, pressed her case through multiple courts, and ultimately won through a series of rulings in 1956 and 1959. She collected that pension for years afterward, while running a small bed and breakfast on Fehmarn, where she decorated her living room with a bronze death mask of her dead husband that visitors described as deeply unsettling. She gave occasional interviews to historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers, where she defended Reinhard's legacy and insisted that history had treated him unfairly, without showing even the faintest trace of remorse for the millions who were murdered under programs he personally helped design and implement. Meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, she was tried in absentia and sentenced to life imprisonment, but she never set foot in the country again, and the sentence was never enforced by anyone. Lina Heydrich died in 1985 at the age of 74, having never spent a single day behind bars for anything. The silent wives and the daughters who carried the fire. Not every wife of a Nazi leader chose the courtroom or the memoir as her weapon after the war ended, and some of the quieter stories are just as disturbing as the louder ones. Margaret Himmler, married to SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, who was the primary architect of the entire Holocaust and the man who oversaw the concentration camp system from its earliest days, spent her remaining years in near total obscurity after her husband bit down on a cyanide capsule while in British custody on May 23, 1945. Their marriage had been strained for years before that. Heinrich had taken a young secretary named Hedwig Potthast as his mistress in 1938 and fathered 2 children with her, and Marguerite knew about the affair but tolerated it because she had no other options and wanted to protect her daughter Gudrun. After the war, Marguerite and Gudrun were detained by American forces, dragged to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the war crimes trials, and eventually released in November 1946 into a Germany that wanted absolutely nothing to do with anyone who carried the Himmler name. Marguerite was classified as a high-ranking Nazi Party affiliate, which meant she lost her right to vote, lost her pension, and was restricted to manual labor jobs only. She lived out the rest of her days bouncing between small apartments before moving in with her sister Lydia in the town of Hepen in 1955. She died in 1967 at 73 years old, and she never once spoke publicly about what Heinrich had done or what she knew while it was happening all around her. But Marguerite's silence did not carry over to her daughter, because Gudrun Himmler became one of the most aggressive and unapologetic defenders of the Nazi legacy in all of post-war Germany. She earned the nickname the Nazi Princess and helped found Viking Jugend, an organization modeled directly on the Hitler Youth program from the 1930s that was eventually banned by the German government in 1994. She also became deeply involved with Stille Hilfe, a shadowy network that actively helped wanted Nazis escape justice and flee to South America and the Middle East, including notorious war criminals like Klaus Barbie, the man the French called the Butcher of Lyon for his torture and murder of resistance fighters and Jewish prisoners in occupied France. Gudrun married a far-right politician and kept promoting neo-Nazi ideology publicly and without shame until her death in 2018, 7 full decades after the regime her father built was supposed to have been destroyed forever. And then there was Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, who served as Hitler's private secretary and controlled access to the Führer in his final years. Gerda was described by everyone who knew her as the model Nazi wife in every possible way. She wore traditional Bavarian clothing, kept her blonde hair in a braid, produced 7 children between 1933 and 1940, and submitted to her husband's authority without question, even though he was known to humiliate her in front of guests and treat her, in the words of one Nazi official, as a lower form of being. Gerda never got the chance to reinvent herself or write a self-serving memoir after the war because she fled Berlin with her children during the final chaotic days of April 1945, contracted mercury poisoning during the brutal trek southward through collapsing Germany, and died in March 1946 at the age of just 36. Her orphan children were scattered into various foster families across Bavaria and spent the rest of their lives carrying the unbearable weight of the Bormann name through a country that was trying desperately to forget everything their father represented. The story they all told themselves. What ties every one of these women together, whether they chose death in a bunker, defiance in a labor camp, or decades of quiet denial in a Bavarian apartment, is that not a single surviving Nazi wife ever publicly accepted responsibility for what happened under the Third Reich. Historian James Wiley, who spent years researching the book Nazi Wives, found that every woman who outlived the war used the exact same playbook, regardless of her individual circumstances. They wove together carefully selected personal memories and flattering episodes from their husbands' careers, while blaming others, almost always Hitler himself, for the regime's worst atrocities. They wrote memoirs where they presented themselves as mothers who loved their children, wives who stood faithfully by their men, and ordinary women who simply got swept up in extraordinary historical forces beyond their understanding or control. Emmy Goering published her book in 1967 and died of stomach cancer in Munich in 1973 at the age of 80, still insisting she had done nothing wrong, and still keeping photographs of Hermann in her home. Lina Heydrich published her own memoir in 1976 with the intentionally ironic title, Life with a War Criminal, because she genuinely believed her husband had been wrongly labeled. But the irony was completely lost on every single person who read the book. She even appeared on German television after the Holocaust miniseries aired in 1979 to complain about how unfairly the show depicted Reinhard, and she died in 1985, still collecting her government pension. Anneliese von Ribbentrop, wife of the foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was hanged at Nuremberg in October 1946, fought to keep her wealthy family's fortune intact through every court in West Germany, won every single legal battle, and spent the rest of her life writing books that defended her husband's record without ever acknowledging the suffering he helped cause across an entire continent. Henriette von Schirach, married to Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach, claimed in her autobiography that she had once confronted Hitler directly about the treatment of Jews after witnessing a deportation in the Netherlands, and that Hitler banished her from his presence for speaking up. But she still dedicated the rest of her life to rehabilitating her husband's image, rather than confronting what he had actually done. These women lived full lives, grew old surrounded by their families and their carefully constructed versions of the past, and died peacefully in their own beds, while the millions of people their husbands helped murder never got that chance at all. If this story kept you watching, the video on your screen right now digs into another chapter of World War II that almost nobody talks about. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it.